Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the National Center on Intensive Intervention's webinar on preparing teachers to deliver intervention in virtual settings. This is the first webinar in a professional learning series for faculty and professional development providers that is being hosted by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. My name is Lindsay Hayes, and I'm joined by my colleague, Amy Colpo. We both work for the National Center on Intensive Intervention hosted at AIR. So first, I want to do some housekeeping for this webinar. So throughout the presentation, we're going to ask that you submit any questions that you have into the GoToWebinar chat pod. If you have a technical issue or a question, we'll have someone from our team try to assist you as soon as possible. If you have content-related questions, we're going to devote a good portion of time for questions and answers toward the end of the presentation. So make sure as we're going along that you submit your questions via the chat pod and we will share them with the presenters. I know that a very commonly asked question is where will we be able to access the slides and the recordings from this webinar? So I will let you know that we will post the recording to this webinar as well as the slide deck via our website after the conclusion of the webinar. So please take a look on our website, intensiveintervention.org, for that recording and those slides. First, I want to talk a little bit about the Faculty Professional Learning Series. The National Center on Intensive Intervention, or NCII for short, is funded through the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs. And NCII's mission is to build district and school capacity to support implementation of intensive intervention, specifically for students with severe and persistent learning and behavioral needs. As part of this charge, we also provide support to institutions of higher education that prepare teachers to deliver intensive intervention. This professional learning series is part of that support that we're providing to those institutions of higher education. So for this professional learning series, we want to welcome anyone and everyone who plays a part in preparing, developing, or supporting educators. Those folks might include faculty who are at traditional institutions of higher education doing undergrad or graduate preparation programs to help teachers deliver intensive intervention. Those might be faculty at alternative preparation programs, or they might be professional development providers who are providing on-the-ground supports to help develop teacher skills related to intensive intervention. So whether or not you are a faculty member, a professional development provider, or just someone who's interested in the support of teachers, this professional learning series is going to be for you. Throughout the professional learning series, we're going to be learning from our colleagues and NCII experts about ways to enhance coursework, field experiences, and professional development opportunities to strengthen content related to intensive intervention. And we're going to have an opportunity to share successes, challenges, and lessons learned that will help us enhance both our pre-service professional learning opportunities and in-service learning opportunities for teachers who are delivering intensive intervention. For our agenda for today, I'm going to provide a few considerations that set the stage for intensive intervention in virtual settings, which is our topic for today. Then we're going to dive deeply into 5 practical strategies that faculty and professional development providers can use to strengthen preparation and professional learning experiences. We'll devote a good portion of our time to Q&A, so please make sure you are recording those questions in the chat pod, and then we'll end with a few closing thoughts and a preview of our upcoming webinars in the professional learning series. So first, I want to get a sense of who is with us today. So I'm going to launch a poll for us to get a sense of who is in the audience. So I'm going to give everybody a few moments. Please respond to the poll. It's asking you to select the choice that best describes your current role. Just want to get a sense of who is in our audience today. All right, I want to thank everybody who is responding in the poll. I can see the responses coming in. I'm going to go ahead and close that in just a few seconds, but it looks like the vast majority of our folks are faculty or staff who are coming from traditional preparation programs, which is excellent. We will certainly talk about a lot of considerations today that can be implemented within the context of a traditional prep program. Also have a few professional development providers in the mix and some faculty and staff from alternative prep programs. So I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you for responding. And I'm going to move us along. So the first thing we need to talk about when we think about our shift to virtual learning, which has occurred this spring very suddenly, and we have had to make a lot of adjustments to make this work both for our school structures, our teachers, and the students we serve, we need to think about what kinds of expectations that has put on teachers. And our sort of essential question for the webinar today is going to be, how do we adjust preparation and professional learning experiences to prepare teachers for what lies ahead? And we know there definitely have been some shifts in teacher expectations that have happened. We need teachers who are able to manage rapid transitions to online, virtual, or distance instructional models. We need teachers who, moving forward into the fall, are also going to be able to be very nimble in how they plan for blended or hybrid instructional models. It seems somewhat likely that in the coming school year, we may be working on a model that includes both in-person instruction and remote instruction. So we're going to need teachers to be prepared for those blended or hybrid models. And last, but probably most importantly, we need teachers who are prepared to maintain continuity of learning for our most valuable learners. And this is where NCII really comes into the equation. This concept of continuity of learning is something that we know is going to be very important, but it is especially important for students with severe and persistent learning and behavioral needs. These disruptions to the regular in-person instruction that's happening in our classrooms, we know that is could potentially cause learning loss. We know we're now paused for the summer in most places, and we really need to have our teachers prepared for the fall with an eye on how we are going to think through these issues related to continuity of learning. So a lot of the resources that I will reference today are coming from the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP's website that they have put together to address continuity of learning issues during COVID-19. So within the slide deck, there is a link to that website. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. They have a lot of really great resources about how we can implement strategies for continuity of learning for students with disabilities. And some of the resources that I will reference most often today come from their topical action briefs, which they have for parents and families, teachers, and related service providers. So I would encourage you to take a look at those resources. One of the big ideas around continuity of learning that is specifically captured in those OSEP briefs is this idea that in addition to a shift in teacher expectations, we are also seeing the shift to virtual learning necessitate some shifts in teaching and learning. And something that we are seeing now is this, we're seeing a shift from infrastructure level access issues to a shift on student level access issues. And this is not surprising. You know, this spring we had to make a very rapid, very abrupt transition to virtual learning. And a lot of the access issues that we were thinking about involved infrastructure. So things like, do students have things like computers and devices at home where they can access their virtual instruction? Do they have the right software? Can we video conference? Is there internet access and high-speed Wi-Fi? It's been a big part of these infrastructure level access issues. We've spent a lot of the spring problem solving around infrastructure level access issues, but as we have this point over the summer to pause and prepare for the fall, it's time to start transitioning our thinking from yes, we need to ensure that there is infrastructure level access to our students, but we also need to start thinking about ways that we can leverage that virtual environment to provide student level access. So this is these principles of intensive intervention, making sure that we are providing supports for cognitive and executive functioning in the virtual environment, making sure that our students who have physical or sensory impairments are included in those virtual settings, paying attention to things like reading ability or the ability to use assistive technologies. This is something that we as faculty and professional development providers need to be preparing our teachers for in the fall. Yes, infrastructure level access is important, but we also need to be shifting to how we promote student level access to instruction in the virtual setting. Let's talk about how this impacts intensive intervention delivery. So again, that shift from infrastructure level access to student level access issues really gets us thinking about how we plan individualized intensive intervention for students with severe learning needs. Here on the left, you can see the NCII's graphic that we use to describe our data-based individualization approach, which is our approach to intensive intervention. It goes through that process of beginning with a standardized Tier 2 platform, using progress monitoring procedures to determine if the student has been responsive or non-responsive to that intervention. And then based on those results, going through a process where we are collecting diagnostic data, using that to adapt interventions, and then progress monitoring over again to determine whether the student has been responsive to instruction. This process in the virtual setting, it's going to look a little bit differently. There are definitely some shifts in teacher expectation that we as preparation providers need to get our teachers ready for. We have to think through issues about delivering tier 2 interventions with fidelity. That's sort of the foundation of our intensive intervention process. We need to think about implementing progress monitoring procedures in the virtual setting. We'll show you some resources that you can use when you're preparing your teachers for the fall that they can use to think through those progress monitoring issues. Of course, individualizing and intensifying interventions, it gets back to that idea of we need to think about what student level access looks like in the intensive intervention environment delivered virtually. We also need to make sure in the virtual environment that we're blending academic and behavioral supports. That's very important, and that we are effectively collecting and using data. So with all of this, the question really becomes, how do we, as preparation providers and professional development providers, incorporate strategies into our preparation and professional learning experiences to help teachers get ready for these shifts in intensive intervention delivery? So for the next part of our presentation, we're going to go through 5 practical strategies that you as preparation providers or professional development providers can use to adapt your professional learning experiences to help get your teachers ready for this new reality that we're facing in the fall. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy Copo, who's going to go through our first practical strategy for preparation providers.
Thanks, Lindsay. The first strategy we're going to talk to you about today is modeling using explicit instruction to intensify delivery of virtual instruction. Something that's important to acknowledge as we begin this discussion is that the field doesn't have a lot of research on online learning for students who need intensive intervention, including students with disabilities. And there's a few reasons for this. One of the big ones is that online learning technology has changed very rapidly, even in the last 10 years. Online learning is also a space in which a lot of the vendors are competing for business and are constantly innovating, which has made it difficult to conduct independent reviews and collect data about materials, activities, and so on. A systematic literature that was done in 2012 only identified 6 empirical studies investigating online learning with students with disabilities. And when OSEP was putting together the continuity of learning topical issue brief that Lindsay spoke about earlier, they weren't able to locate any more recent systematic reviews. So when it comes to online learning for students with disabilities and others who need intensive intervention, we find ourselves working from the research that already exists about evidence-based practices for learners with intensive needs, and we have to think about how to translate that evidence-based practice into a virtual environment. Explicit instruction is a great example. We know that explicit instruction has an extensive research base showing it to be effective for students with intensive learning needs. It's also been identified as a high leverage practice in special education. Just as it's important in in-person instruction, it's crucial to provide it in virtual instruction. So we'll spend the next few minutes discussing explicit instruction practices required for effective implementation, and we'll show examples of what this looks like throughout the delivery of a virtual lesson. So we know that research supports that the principles of explicit instruction are selecting an important objective, specifying the learning outcome, designing structured instructional experiences, explaining directly, modeling the skills being taught, and providing scaffolded practice to help students achieve mastery. It's imperative that all of this continues to happen in the virtual environment. Yes, our instructional modalities have shifted to online and distance learning, and yes, we are using a variety of technologies to make that happen, and teachers certainly need support there. But no, we can't leave behind evidence-based practices like explicit instruction that we know are effective for students with intensive learning needs. Our challenge is to take a practice like explicit instruction and help our teachers translate it into the virtual setting. So I'm going to provide you with an example of what that might look like using a lesson structure that follows these principles. So you'll see here that we have an example that contains a lesson opening, the delivery of instruction, and lesson conclusion. Explicit instruction in the opening of the lesson consists of identifying the learning objective and reviewing prior knowledge and skills. So when designing this portion of the lesson, we need to consider how we will ensure students know their learning objectives and how we can activate students' interests and prior knowledge. So some strategies for doing that virtually include having students complete an online quiz as a do now activity as they enter the virtual classroom. The teacher can monitor those responses and based on that reteach virtually as necessary. Another strategy for how to enact this in the virtual setting is that the teacher can screen share the lesson objectives and have students paraphrase the objective in their own words in the chat pod. This gets them involved and their responses show information that might be necessary in the teacher making any modifications or changes to the lesson. You can go to the next slide, Lindsay. Explicit instruction during instructional delivery consists of modeling, guided practice, and individual practice, commonly known as the I do, we do, you do. When designing this portion of the lesson, we need to consider how we will present the material, how you will gradually release responsibility for the task, how you'll provide frequent and varied opportunities for student responses, and how you'll give specific and timely feedback. So some strategies we have for doing this in the virtual setting include having the teacher model the skill by drawing on the whiteboard while conducting a think aloud. Zoom, I know, has a virtual whiteboard option, and if the virtual whiteboard option is too complicated, you can always hold up a physical whiteboard and do that just as well. Another strategy is having students respond to checks for understanding using polls, the annotation feature, and also a thumb up signal. Another strategy would be having the teacher assign heterogeneous groups to breakout rooms during practice time and rotating among them. So still using your grouping strategies with students and then going in and out of the breakout rooms to monitor, answer any questions, and check for understanding. And then finally, another strategy is having the teacher give feedback to individual students via the chat pod. And one of the great features in virtual settings is that you can give feedback to the whole class at once, or oftentimes you can do private messages to individual students. Next slide, Lindsay. Explicit instruction during the conclusion of a lesson consists of reviewing critical content, assigning independent practice, and monitoring and assessing progress. So when we're designing this portion of the lesson, we want to consider how will you provide opportunities for students to demonstrate independent mastery of the task, and how will the teacher assess and give feedback on student performance. So some example strategies for doing this in the virtual setting would be having students take turn as a presenter to share their work. And you can do this through having students share their screen. Having the teacher assigning an online quiz for an exit ticket, and then following up with individual students as necessary after the whole group instruction. And also having students submit videos of their work, including think alouds for teacher feedback.
And I think an important thing to keep in mind here is that when we're implementing this evidence-based practice of explicit instruction, our design questions remain the same. They're the same types of questions we would be asking ourselves whether we're delivering instruction in person or whether we're doing it over the virtual setting. Those design questions remain the same, but the strategies are different. And I think that's an important takeaway that we as prep providers need to be imparting on our teachers, that the principles of explicit instruction remain the same, those design questions remain the same, but the strategies that we use to translate that into a virtual setting may be different. And Amy went through a couple really great examples. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think it's very important to reiterate that message that explicit instruction is just as important as ever, and probably more so now that we're in remote learning.
So we want to highlight some example strategies and resources for you that may be beneficial when instructing students on how to design virtual instruction, both when it comes to behavior and academics. So first we'll focus on some behavior strategies. We know the first step in setting up any classroom is to teach and model expected behaviors. and this can be done effectively through a behavior teaching matrix. The Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports has a brief that we have linked in this presentation, which describes how to do this through a behavior teaching matrix for remote instruction. So the example you see on this screen is a remote learning matrix for elementary students. It can be found in the brief. School-wide PBIS is an evidence-based framework for improving school climate, social emotional competence, and academic achievement, and decreasing unsafe behavior in schools. Just as in a brick and mortar school, PBIS can be used to make virtual online education more effective. And with a few adaptations, teachers can use this PBIS framework to make remote learning safe, predictable, and positive. Next slide. We'd also like to highlight the sample lessons for educators from NCII. Again, these are linked here in our presentation. We provide a series of reading lessons to support special education instructors, reading interventionists, and others working with students who struggle with reading. These lessons address key reading skills and incorporate instructional principles that can help intensify and individualize reading instruction. The reading lessons are examples of brief instructional routines that may be used to supplement reading interventions, programs, or curricula that are currently in place. And these lessons generally take between 5 and 10 minutes. These lessons are accompanied by a user guide seen here. And this user guide provides an overview of reading concepts and instructional principles to support students who need intensive intervention in reading, information about how to use the NCII lessons, and additional resources to support instruction. We also provide a series of math lessons. The lessons and activities are organized around 6 mathematics skill areas that are aligned to college and career-ready standards and incorporate several instructional principles that may help intensify and individualize math instruction and assist teachers and interventionists working with students. Like the reading lessons, these are meant to supplement instruction. And then we've also developed a series of behavioral strategies to support teachers working with students with primary academic deficits and challenging behaviors. Each strategy incorporates key terminology, an overview of the purpose, and all associated materials. The strategies also integrate approaches for intensification for students with more challenging behaviors. And these materials are organized around the 3 overarching areas of antecedent modification, self-management, and reinforcement strategies. And then what you'll see here is ready-to-use content for faculty and professional development providers. Through a collaboration with the University of Connecticut, NCII has developed a set of course content focused on developing educator skills in using explicit instruction. This includes the 4 modules listed here to support faculty and PD providers with instructing pre-service and in-service educators who are learning to implement explicit instructions. So these are a lot of great virtual resources that we have on our website that we encourage you to check out as you are helping students to design virtual instruction. So I am going to hand it back to Lindsay to discuss our second strategy.
All right, thanks, Amy. So our second practical strategy for preparation and professional development providers is to blend synchronous and asynchronous learning supports. So let's talk about what that means and what that will mean for teacher preparation. So first, let's talk about these definitions of these different instructional modalities. Synchronous instruction very basically means learning activities that are occurring in real time. So some examples of those things are traditional classroom instruction. All students are together, same place, same time. Learning is happening in real time. We've now moved to things like virtual class sessions, teleconferencing, and live stream lectures. Those are still synchronous activities because students are learning together at the same time. Another modality that we have to think about more so now than ever that we have moved to virtual instruction is what we do for asynchronous instruction. So asynchronous instruction are these learning activities that are occurring independently of time. So these are not learning activities that are dependent on students being able to participate in learning at the same time together. They can happen independently and on people's own time. So examples of asynchronous instruction techniques include discussion boards, self-paced modules that can be accessed on demand and you can move through at your own pace, and pre-recorded lectures or videos. And something that we have to be thinking about as we prepare teachers to go into the fall is how we can blend these supports, these synchronous and asynchronous supports for intensive intervention. In a traditional, in-person classroom environment, obviously most of our intensive intervention instruction is happening in a synchronous manner. And we traditionally tend to think of instruction in schools happening in that way, having it be synchronous. And the asynchronous supports, traditionally, mostly that's been homework. We have a real opportunity here and an opportunity to prepare our teachers to think a little bit differently about that. We have to think about how we can blend these supports together for intensive intervention. So much like Amy provided that really great example of what explicit instruction could look like in a virtual setting, I'm going to talk about what blended supports for intensive intervention might look like in a virtual setting. So in this chart here, we have our NCII's 4 intensification practice categories. So when we're talking about adapting or individualizing or intensifying an intervention, we think about it along these 4 categories. The first way that we can intensify or individualize an intervention is to change the intervention dosage or time. And this is always one that people ask questions about because it gets into issues around just hours in a day and the amount of time we have available for instruction and scheduling. But I want to challenge us all to think of it as more than just creating extra time for instruction in a day. Something that we need to think about that is very important for students with intensive learning needs is providing them with more frequent opportunities to respond. So we have an opportunity here to blend synchronous and asynchronous supports around this. We can use features that we have available to us through virtual classrooms to increase the frequency of those opportunities to respond, things like polling features like I demonstrated earlier, annotation or use of the chat pod, so that maybe we can't add more time into the virtual school day, but we can make sure that we are providing students with more frequent opportunities to respond and receive feedback. The virtual setting, I know this can be both a challenge and an opportunity around scheduling. Think about ways that potentially within those schedules we could provide for shorter but more frequent sessions related to intensive intervention, maybe utilizing breakout groups. And thinking about how we pair that with asynchronous supports. So an example of an asynchronous support that could provide is providing access to a recorded intervention session that maybe a student and a family member could access again to see that intervention happen again and potentially use it as another practice opportunity that increases the amount of intervention time or the dosage that they receive. Another thing that I alluded to there, it's really important that in terms of asynchronous support for students, we as teachers are providing supports for the parents and families to conduct those additional practice opportunities with their student. So we have to get a little creative here about how we blend synchronous and asynchronous supports to make sure that we are providing the time, the synchronous time when the student is with an interventionist in class, and asynchronous supports later on. Same thing for our second intensification practice category, which is changing the learning environment to promote attention and engagement. And obviously the shift to a virtual setting, that has already been a massive change in the learning environment. But there are ways that we can prepare teachers to use this for their advantage. Small group and individual instruction absolutely can still happen in a virtual setting, and I think something we need to do is make sure we're preparing our teachers to use that ability to have a combination of whole group, small group, and individual instruction using the technology we have available to us. In terms of promoting attention and engagement, we know that it's very important that we are increasing on-task behavior during that virtual instruction. We know that this is something that a lot of students struggle with, so we need to make sure for those synchronous supports, we're providing those reminders to help students stay on task. And then for asynchronous supports, perhaps those supports that are provided during the lesson can be paired with things like a virtual class resource space. So ways that students can access materials from the class after the live class session is over, and providing a repository where we can house those multimedia resources for them to go back and reference. Our third intensification practice category is combining cognitive processing strategies with academic learning. So this gets at the idea that it's not enough to simply be teaching content. We have to help students with intensive learning needs match that with strategies that they can use to monitor and regulate their own learning. So in a synchronous class session in the virtual setting, that means making sure that we're preparing teachers to think through how they're going to provide access through things like virtual note-taking templates or graphic organizers. What are they going to do in that live class session to help students with their self-regulation and self-monitoring supports? And the same thing in an asynchronous setting. We have to think about what supports do students need when they are not together for synchronous class instruction. And I think a lot of that might center on providing supports with offline organization skills. Students are no longer carrying a backpack to and from school, but that does not mean the organizational issues have gone away. So we have to prepare our teachers to think a little bit differently about how do we support offline organization in a virtual environment when we know students may have materials that they are looking at during their virtual class sessions that they need to keep organized. The fourth intensification practice category is modifying the delivery of instruction. So as Amy mentioned, in a synchronous environment, we can't lose those evidence-based practices that we know to be effective for students with disabilities and students with other intensive learning needs. We have to make sure that that synchronous instruction, we are planning so that it is explicit, it's systematic. We are using universally designed instruction that includes that combination of visual and auditory support. And we need to make sure that we're increasing opportunities for a student to receive immediate high-quality corrective feedback. On the asynchronous side of things, those in-class opportunities need to be paired with structured independent practice opportunities that have very intentional opportunities for feedback. So some things that we've seen used creatively are students submitting a video of them reading or a video of them doing a think aloud through a math problem for the teacher to comment on, use of things like online quizzes, the list goes on. The idea, again, is that we have to make sure that we keep these principles of high quality, effective instruction the same, but we recognize that the strategies that we use in our virtual platform, we need to tweak. Some planning considerations as we're thinking about providing intensive supports in the virtual environment. We have some at the student level. We know that age or grade will definitely have an impact on how we deliver intensive intervention. It's obviously the same in an in-person learning environment, but our younger students who don't have as long of an attention span, we need to make sure that we're providing supports in the virtual environment that are appropriate for their age, grade, or developmental level. We need to be thinking about their self-regulation abilities, what is a reasonable amount of time for instruction, and how can we help students monitor how they're engaging in their learning. And we also, when we're planning for synchronous and asynchronous supports, need to think about the availability of family support. We'll talk about that a little later on in the presentation, but it's a very important thing that when we're moved to this virtual environment, we have to think about what happens synchronously and what happens asynchronously, recognizing that on that asynchronous side of things, we're not alone. We have to get the families involved and prepare our teachers to enlist family members to be instructional supports. At the group level, obviously, when we're planning for a blend of synchronous and asynchronous supports, frameworks, instructional planning, design, and assessment frameworks like Universal Design for Learning are very important, making sure that we're providing multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And as Amy mentioned, similar frameworks that help us set up group level instruction like positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS. It's going to be very important as we plan for how we're going to blend what happens when we're together live during class and what students do on their own. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to talk about strategy 3.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Our third strategy is planning for adjusting progress monitoring and data collection procedures. From what we've heard so far, this is definitely one of the biggest challenges of in-service teachers, especially as a lot of times it involving the family, which is a challenge in itself if parents are not at home, if they're working essential jobs. So if you want to go to the next slide, Lindsay. We'll talk about some resources a little later on that our COP members have created. But for now, we want to highlight this NCII resource. We have a collection of frequently asked questions on collecting progress monitoring data virtually. This is intended to provide a starting place for considering how to adjust the collection of data. So this document addresses questions to consider when deciding whether to conduct virtual progress monitoring, how you know if a tool can be used virtually, the benefits to conducting virtual progress monitoring, limitations of conducting virtual progress monitoring, and then what should be understood about interpreting scores, specifically when it comes to measuring rates of improvement and using end-of-year benchmarks to set goals and compare progress. This FAQ also addresses concerns about validity and accuracy about conducting progress monitoring virtually, considerations for communicating with parents, and what educators should consider when preparing the administration of an assessment. So this document isn't going to tell you exactly how to adjust your progress monitoring, but it is going to give you a long list of things to consider before you adjust your progress monitoring and data collection. And like I said, towards the end of this presentation, we will show you some examples that current educators have come up with for how they are collecting progress monitoring data during this time. Next slide, please. We also want to quickly highlight our updated tools charts. We've improved the look and the functionality of the 6 tools charts that are listed here. And these redesigned charts let users quickly and easily find the right amount of information for their needs. The changes were based on feedback that we solicited from tools charts users with the goal of creating a more user-friendly experience. So while we have streamlined the charts, we did maintain the depth of information and level of rigor. So we encourage you to view these new tool charts and update your bookmarks with the new URLs to them. And Lindsay, I'll pass it back to you for the 4th strategy.
Okay, our 4th practical strategy for prep providers is to create additional opportunities for observation and feedback for our teachers. So virtual instruction presents a real opportunity here, and I do like to think of it as an opportunity. This shift to virtual instruction means that taking video of classes is more possible now than ever. Of course, any videos that are taken have to, and any videos that are taken and shared have to adhere to any privacy and confidentiality rules that are set out by your school, your district, or your institution. But as a teaching and learning tool, the virtual environment has done a good thing because video is going to be more available now than ever. So something I want us to think about as prep providers is how we are leveraging this opportunity to see video of virtual instruction as a teaching and a reflection tool. So video observation analysis, a good thing that it can do is really just providing examples of high quality, effective instruction. I'm going to go through a few examples that NCII has put together, but we're really seeing this as a need in the field. Teachers want to see what high quality instruction looks like in a virtual setting. NCII, we're starting to provide resources here, but this is something that I think will be a real benefit to being able to easily record and edit and capture virtual instruction. What it's also going to allow us to do is to increase the frequency of practice and feedback opportunities. And here I specifically want to address our pre-service teachers. Pre-service teachers, I think, have become very accustomed to recording themselves doing instruction as part of their coursework or as part of something like the NTPA where they are required to submit video. So we're accustomed to this idea, but moving this into the virtual setting means that we have a real opportunity to increase how frequently this is happening. We also have an opportunity to potentially just using editing equipment or just simply pausing and resuming recording. We can see longer segments of instruction that are then sort of edited in real time down to what is useful. And all this serves to increase those frequency of practice and feedback opportunities for teachers. So something I would challenge you as preparation and professional development providers is to think, how can we leverage video for virtual instruction and really increase how we are providing feedback opportunities for our teachers. It also is a great self-reflection tool for teachers. If possibly sharing internally or maybe even with a wider audience isn't possible, this video instruction is going to allow teachers to reflect on and improve their own instruction. And we provided through NCII, and I'll show you a link to this where you can find a resource related to video analysis as a strategy to help teacher candidates. And I think it's something we need to be thinking about integrating into our preparation and professional learning experiences. So I mentioned NCII has some new resources in this area. We have an educator example of a virtual implementation of an intensive intervention reading lesson. So those sample lessons that Amy just mentioned, specifically the ones that are for literacy and reading, we have an example of one of our fabulous NCII staff members who is going through that NCII sample lesson with her son, and she is going through it like she is a teacher. So you can see what we mean when we talk about virtual implementation of an intensive intervention lesson. We have a really great example here. It also has some supplemental materials to support that video, some tips for educators handout, and again, all of those materials Amy went over that go with those sample lessons. So I'm going to move right into strategy 5. This is our final practical strategy and something that I think is going to be very, very important. We need to make sure we're preparing teachers to promote collaboration with team members. So, you know, parents have always been an important part of the intensive intervention process, but in the process of this rapid shift to virtual instruction, the role of the parent has become more important than it ever has. We need to make sure that we are preparing teachers who know how to enlist team members for intensive intervention in virtual settings. So we want to prepare our teachers to be thinking broadly about who those virtual collaborators might be. So parents and families, it's an obvious one. We need to make sure that particularly as we're doing, you know, those consultation, collaboration, and teamwork classes that are part of a lot of pre-service educators' program of study. We need to be thinking about, well, how do you enlist parents and families for intensive intervention? Your general ed teachers and your paraprofessionals, how are you leveraging those folks to maybe push in or push out of your virtual classroom? How do you get them to be involved in intensive intervention delivery? And finally, our related service providers. I know related service providers certainly have their own challenges for how they maintain continuity of services and learning during this time. That OSEP website about continuity of learning has resources that specifically address related service providers. But I think it's more important now than ever that we're preparing teachers who know that they need to be thinking about how they leverage all these other potential collaborators that they have to help support intensive intervention delivery that's happening in their virtual classroom. We have a few examples that we're really excited about at NCII. I showed you the example where it was an educator going through the lesson. We also have some video examples where it's someone going through the lesson as a parent. So we have an example of how a parent might support one of those reading lessons that we have through NCII, and we also have a mathematics example where it's actually a grandparent who is going through it with the student. So if you want to show your pre-service or in-service educators some examples of how they can support parents to get in on the game of intensive intervention, these are great resources to look at. We also have a tip sheet for parents about how generally they can use NCII sample lessons to support continuity of learning during COVID, and we hope that they're using these tips in conjunction with those videos. So I'm going to really briefly turn it back over to Amy, who's going to talk through some IEP meeting resources, since that definitely speaks to the idea of our teachers being able to bring everyone together and coordinate them, and then we will move into Q&A.
Thanks, Lindsay. So we want to highlight a few IEP meeting resources, both from NCII and the Progress Center. For those of you not familiar, the Progress Center is a new OSEP-funded center, which I work on. We provide information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators and leaders in developing and implementing high-quality educational programs that ensure students with disabilities have access to free, appropriate public education, allowing them to make progress and meet challenging goals. So that's our little spiel and plug for the Progress Center. But one of our first resources we've created is a virtual IEP meeting tip sheet along with a sample agenda. This resource was developed through a collaboration between multiple OSEP-funded centers in response to requests from state and local education agencies and parents about how to hold and participate in virtual IEP meetings. So the resource includes technology tips, tips for hosting virtual meetings, and tips for participating in virtual IEP meetings. Additional infographics are available for participating in virtual meetings in English and Spanish as well. So we have the links here, and to answer a few of the questions already, to reiterate what Lindsay said at the beginning, we will be sending out the slide with these links as a follow-up to this session. So we encourage you to check out those resources as well as the rest of the Progress Center website. NCII also has tools to support intensive intervention data meetings. These resources include information for both those leading and participating in the meeting, sample agendas, tools for analyzing data, and note-taking templates. So although these tools were designed for use within the DBI process, they can be adapted and expanded to support data meetings across the tiers of MTSS or to support IEP teams. So we encourage you to check out these IEP meeting resources, and they can be used when we are teaching our teacher education students how to conduct virtual IEP meetings. And then we would love to take this time to answer some questions that you have. I know there are already some in the chat box, but feel free to put any questions in there that you currently have. Let's see. So one good question is, and I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, Lindsay, someone wants to know how we can prepare for virtual networking. So this is good content and tips for training teacher educators, but in-person networking was what enhanced their job application and interviews. So how do we prepare them without this in-person networking?
So it sounds like that is related to networking to be able to be hired and to get jobs. NCII has not put out any specific resources related to that, but I do know that there are places that are starting to put out guidance related to, and it's specifically for districts related to how you hire in a virtual setting. I know, I believe the two OSEP centers I'm aware of, I think the Center for Scaling of Evidence-Based Practices, the CISIP Center, might have some resources related to that, as does the Center for Great Teachers and Leaders at AIR, so that's gtlcenter.org. It might be worthwhile to just explore what's out there related to those resources for how teachers who are looking for jobs can virtually network. So I would point you toward those as a starting point and say that NCII, as of right now, does not have anything related specifically to that topic.
We are getting a few questions about parent involvement. How do we encourage parents who feel overwhelmed and don't want to actively participate in their children's distance learning?
It's a great question, and it's, parents got a real field promotion this spring into being involved in their child's learning, and totally recognize there are a lot of circumstances, including just needing to provide for basic family needs that prevent parents from potentially engaging as much as they could. I think that the key is that we have to be preparing our teachers to be ready for a variety of scenarios. So what do you do when you have a parent who is ready to help but doesn't know where to start? Well, maybe point them towards some of those NCII parent resources. Or what do you do if in this situation where you have a parent who just doesn't want to engage? What can you as a teacher do? And I think the key here is really starting small, starting with a manageable chunk. There are a lot of resources floating around right there that are intended for parents, intended for educators, and sometimes, it's very well intentioned, but sometimes there can be resource fatigue. Maybe starting with one or two really, really focused points for these parents who aren't engaged, something that is manageable, something that is bite-sized, something that they can digest easily and be able to implement right away to help their student. I think that would really be a useful starting point. And again, I do believe NCII in those parent video examples has a really great resource. It shows step by step what it looks like. It's not a perfect situation. It's real people. It's a real student going through this. And I think starting with something that is really immediate and graspable like that would be a good starting point for a teacher to help try to engage a parent who may be a little hesitant.
I also see quite a few questions about any resources on virtual field experiences.
Excellent question. So as I mentioned, this is the first webinar in a professional learning series. There will be 4 parts to the series, and the next part, part 2 in August, is going to be all about virtual field experiences for pre-service educators. So when we're at the very end of the webinar, we'll make sure we pull that slide up where you can see the upcoming topics, but we felt that that deserved its own separate session, so we're going to be talking about that in early August.
Let's see. We have a question about a struggle with addressing intensive intervention during distance learning has been that for students who are fully included, it can be overwhelming to have all of the gen ed work on top of all the IEP goal work and related services. Do we have any guidance about how to handle that?
I think that something that could help potentially there is really taking a look back through that, as I mentioned, that blend of synchronous and asynchronous supports. Sometimes it does make sense to, split things up into shorter but more frequent sessions, but sometimes it really does not. And it sounds like it is very possible that there are situations where we could potentially be overwhelming a student. In those situations, I would really think, well, what are the highest leverage things that could happen synchronously, and what maybe could we shift to other types of support?
There is some concern that some are questioning live instruction in small groups, saying this may violate FERPA. Do we have any thoughts on that?
In terms of any guidance related to compliance or the law, I would point everybody toward the OSEP continuity of learning website. This transition to virtual instruction definitely has surfaced issues related to legalities, implementation of IEPs, FERPA, all of those things. So I know OSEP has started compiling guidance and resources that are related to that. So I would encourage everybody to go to that OSEP continuity of learning website. Perhaps Amy or Eliza, you could put that link in the chat pod for everyone. I would highly encourage you to start there for any questions you have related to the legal side of things.
Thanks, Lindsay. We're also getting quite a few questions about the links that we have in this presentation. And just to reiterate again, we will be following up with all of the attendees who have joined us today, sending out these slides that have the links to all of these resources. And again, we also encourage you to check out our website, intensiveintervention.org. So I think with that, we want to leave you with some final considerations and also show you a few examples that might be helpful for you. So before we close, we just have a few final considerations for when preparing teachers to deliver intervention in virtual settings. So first, knowledge in the area of virtual instruction is continuously emerging. We know more about it now than we did 3 months ago, and I'm sure we'll know more in 3 months from now than we currently do. Because this research is emerging, we have many opportunities for research and development of resources, especially as faculty and PD that are responsible for preparing teachers. We just encourage you to use this learning experience and everything that you're learning in this new territory with preparing your students. We encourage you to use it as an opportunity for action research and sharing that research with the field. The field could really use a lot more research and resources in this area. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that. We also encourage you to consider creating video examples of virtual instruction. Just as we talked about the importance of providing explicit instruction to students, it's really important that we model what strong virtual instruction and intervention looks like to our teachers. NCII has started to do this, as we saw earlier, and the field is really clamoring for this right now. So to the extent that which you're able to create these and share them with a broader audience, I know that would be appreciated by everyone in the field and your colleagues. And that brings us to our third consideration. If you create examples, if you conduct research, or if you just find anything helpful during this time, we just encourage you to be sharing resources with your colleagues. I know a few of you have put in resources for us in the chat box now, which I haven't seen before, which will be very helpful for us. So we appreciate that, but we're all wanting and needing to learn right now. So we encourage you to share the beneficial resources you find amongst each other. And we also want to encourage you to stay tuned for further NCII resources. We are currently creating products in response to teacher needs right now and student needs. And we're going to highlight the new resources on Twitter and in our newsletters, but you can also check our website for updates, intensiveintervention.org. Next slide, please. Yep. One thing we want to highlight really quick is work that has resulted from a community of practice that we had this past spring and some of the great resources that came out of it. So this past spring, we had a community of practice. It has just concluded. The members of this community of practice were practicing teachers who are delivering intensive intervention virtually. So one of their assignments in the COP was to make products that contribute to the field, and they're also beneficial in light of the strategies that we've discussed today. So before they are posted on the NCII website officially, we just wanted to give you a sneak peek at what you can expect and what these products look like. If we can go to the first one. Our first example here deals with virtual screening and progress monitoring delivery, and that was one of our strategies today. This product talks explicitly about the process the teacher used to deliver progress monitoring and screening materials to her students' health. It walks through the process of how she set up her Zoom classroom and utilized the breakout rooms to administer screening of this progress monitoring. And also with that, how she had parents help in this process. Go to the next one. The second final draft you'll see here is using mathematics manipulatives virtually. So this has a video that walks through how to use slides. So this is a virtual lesson with base 10 blocks. It's a series of slides, and then it's a video that walks through how to use these slides in your instruction. And our final example is how to support parents with collecting data on IEP goals. So here you'll see on the left, we have a paper form that can be printed out and mailed to parents. And then also on the right, an online form. So this product is about helping parents collect data on IEP goals. So again, these are great resources that have come out of our spring COP that will eventually soon be on our NCII website, and I think will be beneficial to everyone during this time. And lastly, we just want to remind you of our upcoming webinars in this series. In August, we will be doing practice-based opportunities for intensive intervention. Our third webinar in October focuses on course content resources for intensive intervention. And then our final webinar in December focuses on continuous program improvement. And we want to remind you that because of our GoToWebinar platform, you do need to sign up with each individual link. So just because you were signed up for this one does not mean you are automatically signed up for the other three. So make sure that you register individually for the other three upcoming webinars.
So that concludes our first webinar of our professional learning series. We thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. We hope that you join us for the next three. And please, in the meantime, take a look at the intensiveintervention.org, where we'll post the slides from today and the recording, including the links to all the resources that we mentioned. So thank you for joining and have a great day.